love is not, love's at the heart of the gospel because love is at the heart of creation. Love goes all the way down. That the earth is full of the steadfast love of God, says the psalmist in Psalm 33. So love is at the heart of absolutely everything. Stanley can find a liberal sometimes where there aren't liberals, but that's okay, because liberalism really is as terrible a temptation as Stanley had always argued. And of course, what Stanley then is offering as an alternative is a communitarianism, very indebted to Alistair McIntyre. And that kind of communitarianism is absolutely right. I mean, how should an individual read Colossians Remixed? An individual shouldn't read Colossians Remixed. It should be read in community, always read in community, because we learn in community, we grow in community.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. I'm your host, Jared Thomason. Today's guests are Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat. This is, honestly, before I started recording episodes, I wanted to have these two on. I've probably gone to their spam folders a number of times before. I got lucky and got a hold of them. So I'm very grateful to them for taking the time to sit down and discuss this book with me, Colossians Remixed. I go into the story a little bit in the interview, but I changed the way I voted because of this book. I realized that generosity required of me to not think of myself as simply an individual, but to look to the needs of others and forming community as objectives for my life. And that would include the way that I vote and the things that I supported. So at 22, when I read this book, it was formative and is a large part of how I became the man I am now at 42, almost 43. So we'll get right into the interview, except to say, if you're listening for free, please follow, subscribe, whatever it is that you need to do on your platform of choice. Leave reviews, ratings, all that kind of stuff. It's super helpful for me to get that feedback, but it's also helpful because as a smaller independent content creator, I am fighting against the algorithm. There are people who are able to come into digital content creation with money in hand and create more of a presence for themselves and create an audience where they may not have had one because they can buy the exposure, and greater exposure leads to a larger audience. So I need the exposure and I appreciate every little bit. You can do that on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Check the show notes for more opportunities or places that you can follow. There's also social media. I tend to limit my posts to what I've done, what the content that I've created, the people that I'm attempting to highlight in these conversations that I have. So reaching out on social media, following on social media, you'll at least see when an interview is done, what is out there that will be coming your way. Or the ultimate support for me is $5 a month. For $5 a month, you get episodes about 12 days early, starting this year, 2026. So the episode you're going to hear previewed at the end of this one is available right now. So you head on over to patreon.com/It Means What It Means podcast and chip in $5 a month. A little bit goes a long way. It would help me be able to afford things like going to conferences and meeting people and getting more exposure to more things that are happening, particularly in biblical studies. But also it will allow me to broaden the scope of what the podcast can cover, if I can spend more time coming up with things to discuss. I'm also considering additional content that I can provide only over there on Patreon. I've gotten some feedback from Patreon supporters, and I think I may be following those threads in the not too distant future. So, yeah, I think that's all for me. I will be back at the end of the episode to set up next week's. Enjoy my conversation with Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat. Brian Walsh and Sylvia Keesmaat, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Yeah, glad to join you.
Okay, so real quick, just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then just so the listeners know, they have decided how we're going to kick the conversation off after that.
Okay, so I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm a retired campus minister from the University of Toronto, and have had the good honor to work with students through most of my life. Sylvia and I are married. We live at Russet House Farm in the Kawartha Lakes region of Ontario. We live in an off-grid organic farm, and yeah, there's an introduction quick to me.
I'm Sylvia Keesmaat. I'm a biblical scholar by training, and have taught full-time in the past, but now I only teach adjunct at the university and online on a platform that Brian and I both teach on, called Bible Remixed, that we started a number of years ago, which offers courses for anybody who wants to take them, pay what you can, on Zoom. And I also have been deeply involved with our farm, our permaculture farm here, running an heirloom tomato seedling sale. So I also photograph insects. So I do a lot of different kinds of speaking. I speak at horticultural societies and field naturalist groups showing pictures of pollinators. I do a lot of speaking on issues connected to Indigenous justice, gender justice, and particularly climate grief, which is what I'm currently writing a book on at the moment, Climate Grief in the Biblical Story. So that's me. And we frequently I should say that we also live on the traditional lands of the Michi-Sagig Anishinaabe, and we frequently have people living here with us and working with us on the farm. So it's a pretty rich life.
So, because I told you guys in the beginning, like before we started recording, I was on the fence about this, but the story for me with your book, my friend Nate Finch, shout out to Nate, I love you. While he was attending Tabor College in Kansas, he was assigned your book, and there were two books that he recommended. One was What St. Paul Really Said, and then the other one was Colossians Remixed. And I read them both, and I remember 22 years old in 2005, reading your book, and I wish I could pinpoint where, because I know I wasn't done with it yet, but setting it down to like go get something to eat or take a break from reading, because I'm not very good at reading. And I said aloud to no one but me, I can't vote the way that I've been voting. I was a pretty hardcore libertarian, and I think as engaged as I was with Bible study and learning more about biblical studies there in my early 20s, it had always been a little bit more distant than what I was learning from your book. And I think and I know I put this in my questions, I think one of the things that made it stand out, and it was a little bit jarring because it breaks things up, is the formats of how the book is written. The expository, that's the term I use for it, expository portions, and then dialogues, and then the targums. So I can say more about my story if you want, but if we could just jump into discussing the book on that, the format of the book, since that was so interesting to me 20 years ago. How did you guys arrive at that?
Well, that kind of emerged in the writing, but pretty early in the process, we knew that we're going to use diverse genres in this thing. But before I go to that, let me just go back a little bit further about the pre-story to the book itself. I became friends with N.T. Wright, who wrote What Did St. Paul Really Say, when we were both together at McGill University in Montreal, and in the early 80s. And Tom was writing his Tyndale commentary on Colossians, and he asked if I would be a non-technical reader, since I was a theologian but not a biblical scholar. So he would give me manuscript on Tuesday nights. I would go home and read it, and we would argue about it all Wednesday morning, and then have lunch. And in a sense, I was set on the path of writing this book long before Sylvia and I knew each other, trying to answer the questions that I was posing to Tom Wright. And the questions that I was asking Tom were, boy, this is great exegesis, but what does it mean today? How do we live out this story? You might want to talk about, the principality and powers of Mars and Apollo and all these. What are the principalities and powers today? And his response at that time, he's changed since then, it's been a long time, was, I'm a first century historian. Those aren't my questions. He's since realized those are his questions. So then when Sylvia and I met and then developed a relationship and ended up getting married, this project, this writing in Colossians was still in the back of my mind, and it just became clear, well, I've actually got a biblical scholar in the household, a first century historian in the household. Let's get to work on this together. Then Sylvia wants to add to that.
Well, let's say something about the genre question. We've always kind of played around with genre in our preaching, sometimes doing sermons that are narrative. We've sometimes done sermons together, so they've been dialogues, those sermons. And the work that I've been doing on how the New Testament writers reinterpret their scriptures for a new context, how Paul reinterprets his scriptures for a new context. That was called, that was similar to how the rabbis updated biblical texts when they were translating them for people, because first century Christians didn't speak Hebrew anymore. First century Jews didn't speak Hebrew anymore, and they spoke Aramaic or they spoke Greek. So the idea of a targum and an updating of the text for a context, contemporary context, was something that we had also kind of talked about. So all of those choices of genre in the book came out of different ways that we were preaching and teaching and dialoguing about this ancient text, about Colossians, already in other contexts. And then sometimes we would do that and do a sermon or something and say, you know what, that's going straight into the book. we're gonna deepen it a little bit. We're gonna add the footnotes, and that's where it's gonna go. So I think that's how all these different genres emerged as we wrote the book itself.
Yeah, and if the interpretive act of an ancient text, especially scripture, is that you need to find yourself, to understand the text, you need to find yourself in the text and in the story that the text is telling within its own historical context. Well, how can we do that? We're 2,000 years away. Well, that then gives rise to the historical narratives. What happens if we try to hear this text and place somebody as an imaginative construct, obviously, because it's a fiction? What happens if we create a context where Nympha, the character that we use in Colossians Remixed, how would Nympha, given her life, how would she have heard the gospel? How would she have engaged all of the things that Paul is talking about? So that's historical narratives. And then a targum is, if the historical narrative is how would it have been heard 2,000 years ago, The Targum is, how might we hear it today? And the Targum is, rooted in the text, rooted in its historical context, rooted in careful attention to what's going on in the text and in the rhetorical nature of the text. How then might that be heard if Paul was writing not 2,000 years ago to Colossae, but to us then in the context of the globalization of the economy, a post 9/11 world, and an emerging postmodernism. All that goes into making a Targum.
So it's interesting on the looking at the contemporary end, a lot of the critiques of empire that you were offering when this book was published 20 years ago are now mainstream critiques. Here in the United States, it's a bit messy, but we're starting to see a backlash against those things. How much would the book be different today if you were to write it right now? How much would the contemporary end of it be different?
You want to start with that? I mean, I can go.
Well, I mean, we have recently written a book, Romans Disarmed, which does talk about these same imperial themes in a more recent context. That context has been heightened, I would think. I mean, I think the same critique, the same description of empire that we had at that time, empires are rooted in centralizations of power that are based on powerful myths and stories that have strong symbols that support them. And there's one more.
Geopolitical economic control.
And they have strong geopolitical economic control. All of that has just become more true, right? And we have now seen, all of the, it's just much clearer in our contemporary context, all of these forces, imperial forces in our context. I think what's changed a little bit is the depth and the breadth and the width of the deception and deceit and the lies that are pervasive in our culture. When we wrote this book, the complete capitulation of the news cycle and to narratives that are, shall we say, dubious at best, but also the complete control of social media. The fact that most people now get their news within an echo chamber from various kinds of social media. That wasn't something that was happening to such a large degree in 2004. Gee, it's 21 years ago now, right? Things have changed dramatically in terms of how that cultural narrative and in terms of how the symbols that the imperial forces rely on, how powerful they have become, whether those are symbols of catchphrases or whether those are visual symbols. So I think that's the biggest change that's happened over the years.
The scariest thing is that it'd be easier to write it today. I mean, if you're talking about symbols, I mean, the sheer garishness of the gilded gold of the Oval Office today, or of what the shape of the new ballroom is going to look like. I mean, it's so crass, but that's not surprising, because as empires are in decline, they become more extreme, and their excesses are even more over the top. Both their excesses of consumption and of display, and also their excesses of violence. It all gets over the top, and so often that violence now is not pointed outwards to the enemy outside, but to the enemy within. Right?
Quotation marks around that.
Yeah.
The enemy within, and I mean, it is so easy now to draw the parallels. I mean, nobody when we wrote this, we weren't drawing parallels between George W. Bush and Nero or Caligula. He was in some ways a modest figure. It's so easy now to draw the parallels between the current president of the United States and somebody like Nero in terms of the violence that he's unleashing on people, which Nero did as well, in terms of the sexual predation, which was a hallmark of Nero as well. Just in terms of how he looks. This week, he's recently asked the Treasury to create a $1 gold coin with his image on both sides. So his profile on one side, and the mock-up that I saw, the image of Donald Trump that would be on that coin looks exactly like the profile of Nero in the later part of his life from the first century. So you're just kind of like, oh my, he actually looks like him too.
It's all pretty on the nose. Yeah.
It's just, it's so on the nose that it's harder, I think, for people to miss the parallels.
Another thing which I think is really germane to the work that Sylvia is doing on climate grief is that while we certainly took an ecological perspective on things in Colossians Remixed and offered an ecological virtue ethic when we were talking about Colossians chapter 3, the climate crisis and the overall ecological crisis is at such a more extreme. So everything's more extreme. It's so more extreme today than it was 20 years ago, and creates all kinds of other cultural and emotional dynamics. If we're talking about the emotional dynamics in Colossians Remixed of postmodern students who have anxiety about how will they make decisions in their lives, the anxiety of our students today is, will there be lives? Will there be lives in the future? Not how I make decisions, but whether the climate crisis has got to a certain point where we can see the end, right? So that leads us into climate grief, and we would have to then read Colossians, as we do when we deal with Romans and Romans Disarmed, in terms of that kind of climate anxiety. That's a huge issue today.
Well, and since then, more research has been done on climate issues in the Roman Empire and the way that Rome was actually an ecological disaster. So the first extinctions that happened in Europe happened under the Roman Empire because they kept clearing all the forests, right? The clearing of the forests, as you know, the reason Rome had to keep moving north and outwards was because wood was the oil of the ancient world. They needed to keep clearing the forests to keep the mines going, to have masts for the ships. So the ecological disasters that they created across Europe is really actually well documented. People in the first century were talking about this. We did not were not aware of any of that research when we were writing Colossians Remixed. So we probably would have focused even more on some of that in light of the great creation hymn in Colossians 1:15-20. If God is reconciling everything on heaven and on earth, that would have had a certain resonance for people in Colossae, where the river was very polluted, where there were mines up in the hills, where sometimes they couldn't see the sun because of the smoke from the mines. That would have had a completely different resonance with the people of Colossae than we were aware of when we originally wrote the book. And it would have been a resonance that we, at least, I don't know where you're located actually, Jared, but I think you told us, but I've forgotten. But we have seen the skies with smoke, filled with smoke in the last number of years. We have seen the sunsets obscured by the wildfire smoke. That is something that the people in Colossae would have been familiar with as well, that kind of choking pollution. So Um, we we would, I think, writing today, probably write that into the book a little more differently.
It seems like, so I understand what you're saying about climate, but bringing it like to ground level, I think the real effect, the most insidious part of idolatry, and this seems to be a thing that's being dealt with in Colossians and in your book in particular, is not simply the act. It's not some like nebulous or ephemeral, you're worshiping the wrong thing, so the direction of your worship is coded incorrectly. But it actually seems like the effect on the ground is things like how we get food, and you end up, when you link that kind of thing to power, it is truly destructive. And honestly, listening to the two of you, I'm like, oh, this sounds like Tolkien's critique of industrialism and modern life. But and to just bring this back to where you guys even said you are, like you live on a farm, so food production and community and power and all of these things. I know that I'm not really resolving this into a question, but like, am I on the right track here?
Yeah, and the reference to Tolkien is a great reference, because, of course, Tolkien's critique of modernity and industrialism, in line with a lot of poets of the Romantic era, is rooted in the fact that he lives in an enchanted world. Right, so everything he writes is about an enchanted world where there are other kinds of creatures that we don't know about, and the world is alive, and that's of course also very clear in Lewis as well. And so the disenchantment of the world that we've experienced in the modern West creates the context for the destruction of that world, and the context for a very profound sense of homelessness. For not just for humans, but the destruction of habitats, and so the vision that we meet in Paul, in especially in the famous Colossian hymn, this is a very enchanted world. This is a world that is alive. Indeed, this is a world, as we point out from later on in Colossians, towards the end of Colossians 1. Where Paul says that the gospel has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, every creature. And the commentators bend over backwards saying that that's just hyperbole, and he doesn't mean creatures, he means humans. But the word is very, very clear. Every creature has heard the gospel. So when we attend here at the farm to creating habitats and encouraging biodiversity, that's of one piece with living in an enchanted world that is God's creation.
And I think it's important. Well, two things are important to remember. One, we wrote that book in the city of Toronto. We didn't live on our farm yet, though we. The backyard was a bit of a crazy garden area. And so that was happening, that kind of deep involvement with what was living and growing in the place that we were. So it's interesting to me, whether we would have written it differently in terms of the socio-political context, and how we would have written it differently if we'd been in this place as well. I think that might have had some effect too. But let me come back to idolatry. You're right that idolatry always bears fruit of some sort, whether that's the fruit of destruction or the fruit of homemaking and nourishment for all creatures on the ground, which is why in the prophets, when Isaiah talks about and Jeremiah talk about idolatry, and they talk about the effect on the land. Jeremiah does this especially, right? If the people are going after the Baals, then the fields are mourning and the pastures are mourning because the land is being destroyed, because the Baals are part of a destructive economic agricultural system that uses up the land and destroys it, that commodifies the land, I guess is the way that you could put it. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that Paul talks about creation, talks about the gospel being proclaimed to all creatures, and then contrasts that good news of the gospel, which is for all creatures, with the idolatry that makes the Colossian believers devalue their bodies, devalue what good food and good drink is. And so I think that's a contrast that is intentional and deeply rooted in the prophetic tradition as well, in which Paul himself was deeply rooted.
So is it safe to say that what the gospel is in this way then is a call to participate in like a love that is inevitable in the face of a thing that seems like the destruction that seems inevitable?
That's a good way to put it. And I think that the language of inevitability is really interesting language, because you have again and again in the biblical story places where you're at a point in the story where an outcome seems inevitable, right? So Abraham and Sarah, they have this promise, yes, but they can't have children and they're both near 100. It seems inevitable that it's not going to happen. And yet God brings new life and new possibility. And where do we see that nation that's promised to them? We see it first in the Exodus, where they are slaves, and it seems inevitable that this is the end of the story. I mean, Egypt's not going to let their slaves go. No culture ever wants to let their slaves go en masse as a people. And yet God intervenes, and the inevitability of that ending isn't carried forward, right? The exile, it seems inevitable that this is the destruction of a people, and yet a remnant returns. Jesus dies. It seems like that's the end of the story, right? And then resurrection happens. And so what we have again in the biblical story, and I think that's what we face now too, in terms of climate destruction, this world spiraling inevitably into more violence, is we worship a God, and our life is rooted in a story in which resurrection is always possible. And you're right, love is the word for what lies behind everything that God wills for the world, for that resurrection and redemption. It grows and is nourished by God's love for us and for creation and for all creatures. And so as we think about our own context, and I think this is what Paul was saying to the Colossians too, when he talked about, a hope in heaven, this hope that's above what we can see with normal sight, is that in the face of inevitability, the language of inevitability, which is the language of empire actually, is that there is always possibility. The biblical story is always saying that God makes possible the impossible. And if we are truly going to live into that story, we need to live as if that future hope that the biblical text sets before us of a new heaven and a new earth, of all things reconciled in Jesus, we need to live as if that's actually the reality. And we are living into that reality. Even though it doesn't seem like, we have no idea how it could be possible.
So that there's a line there. There's a famous, in my life, Sylvia Keesmaat line that got hidden in what you just said. And the line is, inevitability is the discourse of empire. Inevitability is the discourse of empire. Empire always wants you to think that it's inevitable. Resistance is futile. Mm-hmm. That this is simply where history is going and it cannot be countered, right? And the gospel is the discourse of gospel is resurrection and promise and opening. The gospel opens up life to God's intentions, opens up life to shalom, opens up life to justice in the face of what seems to be inevitable. So inevitability is the discourse of empire.
I think to draw all of that together, because and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact phrase you used, Sylvia, but you said something like, a way that we can't understand, but that's where imagination comes in. And I think combining like N.T. Wright's what is it, 5-act play metaphor, but then also Walter Brueggemann's, prophetic imagination. And I know this isn't something that you deal with in the book, but if you've never read Stanley Hauerwas' article or essay on Watership Down and story-formed communities, shout out to Stanley Hauerwas. You could go back and hear my interview with him from a couple of years ago on that. But like looking at the call to fit yourself within a narrative. And so here is a narrative that is, subverting, like, Colossians Remixed, subverting the empire. It is subversive to what is telling you, is guaranteeing you cannot defeat it. And the call for euangelion is, or to the euangelion, the gospel, the good news is, no, that's not true. And there is a different way to do things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also why our mixed genres become important in the book. What we're trying to do is we're trying to set free the imagination, and to do that, you need stories, you need poetry, you need conversation. So that's why we find ourselves doing multiple genre kinds of works. But yeah, it's all about the liberation of the imagination. And as Walter said, and we quote him, that the greatest crisis of the church is the captivity of our imagination, that we simply can't imagine another way forward. But that's what the gospel is all about, and that's what the Spirit is all about, and why how the Spirit I think moves in the scriptures to liberate our imaginations. But not just in the scriptures. It's also all rooted in our praxis. One of the best responses and critiques of Colossians Remixed was in a session at an academic conference, and the person who was giving the analysis of the book was giving this this great presentation saying why he loved the book. And he said, "My question is, where do I sign up? Where do I sign up? I want in." Right? The book is a gospel. The book is evangelism, but there can be no evangelism without a community to welcome folks. Right? This is all the epistemology of the book is all about relationality. It's all about community, and all about the shaping of community. And so that's why then alternative communities and alternative churches that have been set free from the captivity of our imaginations, and indeed set free from the Babylonian captivity and apostasy of the church in our time. We desperately need those kinds of communities, because that's where the truth is not the truth unless it's embodied, unless it is embodied in flesh, in real people, living in real communities with real crises, seeking paths of justice and healing.
I can say something more about imagination too. I think this is what we see in the Book of Revelation as well. That the Book of Revelation is actually describing in all those those vivid images of destruction and war, describing what people in Asia Minor, the churches, the 7 churches that were written to, would have seen all around them. They were seeing that environmental destruction. They were seeing that kind of violence. And the Book of Revelation has this really interesting rhythm of kind of piercing those descriptions with these other descriptions of what's going on around God, the Creator, descriptions of all of creation praising God, all creatures praising God, descriptions of all tribes and nations praising God. And it's kind of, the book is kind of like a spiral. You've got these descriptions of destruction, and then it's just this other world breaks in with these wonderful descriptions of what's really happening. And it's like John is saying, look, the world is showing you these pictures, and they're terrible pictures, but just close your eyes for a minute and realize that just beyond that is this other reality. And you need to be open to that other reality. You have to disconnect your imagination from everything that the world is trying to tell you about what's normal, violence and destruction as normal, and realize that praise praise to the Creator, who is actually the one who is bringing newness. That's where your imagination needs to dwell, because that's what's true. And that's why the book ends up with this beautiful vision of this kind of reforestation of this city with a river running through it, which takes you right back to the beginning of the story, right? The beginning of the story is in Genesis, is God, the Creator, hoping to hang out with a whole by a river in a food forest with all kinds of creatures and a couple of naked vegetarians. Right? That's the beginning of the story. And by the end of the story, the end of the book of Revelation, we have the Creator hanging out by a river in a food forest with all tribes and nations and all creatures singing praise to the Creator. Like that was God's plan, and God's, come hell or high water, God's going to see this plan through.
Hell or high water.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what we're living through right now.
Yeah.
And so, and I think Colossians is a stop on the way. Paul is saying in your journey towards that reconciliation of all things in Colossians 1:20, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like to live faithfully into that imagination and into that vision.
And since we're on the book of Revelation, let's also notice that that new city has a wall around it. It has a wall and it has gates, and the gates are never shut. Could you imagine having a culture where you acknowledge the need for boundaries, you now acknowledge the need for borders, and maybe even the need for walls? But there's always gates, and they're always open, because while it's a wall that identifies certain kinds of distinctions, the gates are open, and folks are always welcome in. And then Paul will take that even further in Ephesians and say in Christ the wall is actually broken down. Whether there's a broken down wall in Paul or a wall with gates open, hospitality is at the heart of this vision,
which is a tough narrative. I'm trying to bring some threads together. The deforestation thing, I've been thinking about that, and I'm glad you mentioned that just now, Sylvia, because I was thinking about, the Romans had to expand because like taxation systems for them were not the same as they are for us, for most like modern, what we call developed nations, where it's built into a responsibility of residency or citizenship. Like citizenship brought other benefits, but taxation was a burden placed as you expanded. And as you expanded, you would then incorporate those people, but then have to continue expanding. And I think there was a narrative that had kind of reached its denouement around the time that you were writing this book. And now we're seeing it fall apart, that like, hey, we've built a system, a trade system. And so the responsibility for your domestic well-being through taxes, that's up to you. But the trade system was never just, which is not the problem that anyone has with it right now. Like the NAFTA being blown up had nothing to do with how unjust it was. I think it's just a backlash against that normalcy. And that's a whole read Corey Robbins' Reactionary Mind. That's how I would explain what's happening with that. But the narrative, I think, in this time of upheaval is not to remember how bad the global war on terrorism was, but to think how stable most of life was. At least I'm saying this, and I don't think I did tell you, I'm in Houston, Texas. So as an American, particularly in an oil city, people just want things to be stable the way they were, 25 years ago, that kind of thing. So the competition of narratives right now, it's like there's a very overtly, and I'm not just talking about any one world leader. Like there are just reach in the bag and pull out an authoritarian's name. We could be talking about Viktor Orban, and the narrative for Viktor Orban is, I'm bringing this new kind of stability because the old one didn't work for us. And what you're saying is, yeah, the old one didn't work, and we told you that because there is something different. But because it's pushing back and attempting to replace something, so Viktor Orban is himself subverting something, but he is not subversive in the way that you're saying the gospel is, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you raised the question of stability, because there's always a question of stability for whom, right? Who did the old stable order work for? So, in Texas, it worked for white people, right? It didn't work for indigenous peoples. Didn't work for Latina people or Latinx people. It didn't work for Black people. And that's true for all of Turtle Island, right? For all of North America, that stable system worked for those who had power and those at the center of the system. It also didn't work for white folks who were the working poor. And I think that when you talk about the destruction of a system, I was just talking about this on another podcast a few days ago. When you're talking about being subversive subversive in relation to a system, there is exactly what you're talking about. Subversive for whom, and who are the people who are being destabilized, and who is the subversion working for? So you're right. What's happening in the United States right now is destabilizing a system that is going to impact those on the most marginalized in that system in terrible, terrible ways. But a lot of those people wanted a destabilization of the system because they didn't see it working for them, right? Either. And so seeing that system destabilized, at least theoretically, meant, well, maybe it will work better for us if it's no longer working for those who have power. The problem is it's being destabilized so that power is being concentrated in ever smaller circles of influence and power. And so, the fall of the Roman Empire, while it carried with it, immense suffering for all kinds of people, wasn't a bad thing. What happened in Europe, we have a really interesting book at home called A City Through Time, and it's loosely based on London. So you see London back in the prehistoric periods, and then you see it develop over the centuries into this huge metropolis under Rome. And there's incredible inequality in the city at that time. And it's environmentally terrible. And then the whole thing collapses, and it goes back into what we tend to call in history the Dark Ages, which meant that whole civilizational structure kind of fell apart. But what you see is a reversion to a way of life that is much more sustainable on the land, and a reversion to a way of life where the commons was more prevalent, and where people lived in villages that worked well for everyone again. So there's this, it's a really interesting topic. What happens, who stability works for, and what happens when that stability is undermined. And I think Paul is actually saying, look, we are subverting the stability of this violent, overarching empire by forming small alternative communities that do everything the empire doesn't do, that provides support, that provides food for people who are hungry, that doesn't base itself on violence and exclusion, but rather on the kind of welcome that Brian was talking about. And ironically, we are seeing that right now. If you look at what's happening in Chicago or in Portland, you have whole neighborhoods coming together and walking kids to school so that their parents don't have to be worried about being snatched by ICE. You have people in neighborhoods buying food for people who don't want to go out to the grocery store because they're afraid of being snatched by ICE. You have communities coming together to serve lunches and to have meals for people whose SNAP benefits are being cut. So there is this groundswell of community forming. Sometimes it's in churches, a lot of times it's outside of churches, to create this alternative, welcoming, safe, feeding and nourishing community for people who are most at risk with what's happening in the empire. And that's the beauty of what's happening in the middle of all the horrors happening in the United States right now. And those are the kinds of communities I think Paul was calling us to create.
Brian, anything to add?
Oh my goodness. there could be lots to add. I think the one thing that I would say is a cautionary to what Sylvia just said is that what we have right now is the billionaire class trying to tear down everything to create chaos, because the billionaires love chaos. They love a chaos where the rule of law does not apply to them. They love a chaos where the tax benefits are all to their benefit. They love a chaos where the poor really, really do get more and more and more destitute, right?
Mm-hmm. Disaster capitalism. It's
disaster capitalism, what Naomi Klein calls it. And so what we see right now, I think, is at the end of empire is always an incredibly dangerous time. But such endings also, from a gospel perspective, create the possibility of new beginnings.
I like that. And I'm glad you guys brought up Naomi Klein. Because I didn't realize until I was flipping through the back of the book, this is where I learned about no logo. And then eventually, well after, I think a few years after I read the book, Shock Doctrine came out. But I think about no logo a lot, even still. That there will be, some news story or some cultural conversation. And I'm like, man, she really cracked that nut. Like, she really figured that out 30 years ago now, right? Yeah. If not, yeah. Was it 95 or somewhere in there, mid to late 90s? But yeah, that book, No Logo, just the idea of brands, and especially if you're trying to have a modern discourse of what idolatry is, that is really helpful. Understanding what brands are,
and then the shock doctrine, was shock capitalism. I mean, as every new catastrophe happens in the world, you just think, okay, Naomi, is it going to work here? Yeah. It's the same stuff over and over again. The same strategies are used. And then, since we're talking about Naomi Klein, who is a Canadian, her book, This Changes Everything, on climate, the climate crisis. That's, I think, one of her most personal books. And there we see Naomi Klein, who really is pretty much a Marxist, though I've argued that she's not radical enough in her Marxism, but nonetheless, in This Changes Everything, all of a sudden she starts talking about, we need a new story. We need a new spirituality. And she doesn't quite know how to name that. But there is this recognition that narrative really is at the heart of all of this, and that all of this is deeply spiritual, not just personally, but in terms of the spirit of the times and the spirit that will guide our civilization. So it's been really interesting to sort of walk our life alongside reading what Klein has been writing over the years.
And as again, a caution against the shock doctrine, I think you need to read it alongside Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, which talks about exactly that kind of communal coming together in the midst of disaster that you also find from the grassroots.
And if we're plugging books, maybe I can just plug my next book. Comes out from Cascade in next year. It's called Of Prophets, Priests, and Poets, Christian Formation at the Gates of Hell. And it's a series of essays and reflections on Christian formation, which ends with a new Targum on Colossians 3, called On Not Forgetting Who We Are, that was written on the eve of the 2024 election.
Well, you can expect an invitation from me to come back and talk about that book. Man, you guys are already throwing recommendations out there. Hold on. I just want to take a second. So, and maybe I don't have an off the top of my head understanding that's adequate, but just to address the term Marxism. So Marxism being like a methodology for understanding history, economics, sociology, government, that's predicated on the idea that class conflict between working people and wealthy people. Is that a good summary of what Marxism is?
Yeah, that's a good summary of what Marxism is. It wants to look at dynamics of class. It wants to look at dynamics of capital. Who has the capital, and how is the capital being used? Its difficulty is that Marxism tends to be. I mean, it's called dialectical materialism. Right. So and it tends to be less dialectical and more materialist, I think, in many of its expressions. So that really the way in which culture and religion is the opiate of the masses, culture, religion, even the arts, they're kind of the superstructure that is laid on top of the substructure, which is really economic activity. And it ends up being an economism, just like capitalism is an economism. It really reduces value to economic transaction. So capitalism and Marxism are rivaling siblings in the rise of an Enlightenment kind of a culture. They're both materialists. And what the gospel offers, I think, is an alternative to that, and not just the gospel. Indigenous culture rejects that kind of a materialism as well, that recognizes the spirituality that's at the heart of all things. And so we can only understand our economic transactions by understanding the spirit in which those transactions happen. So anyway, that's my long way of saying curse on both houses.
And as a bridge, so we have liberalism, and I don't mean what has come to be like the shorthand for left ideology in American politics, but like liberalism in the liberal Democrat kind of thing. Like Stanley Howard Watts. So again, in that same essay about Watership Down, he says like Christians should not necessarily adopt liberalism, and I'm paraphrasing, should not necessarily adopt liberalism as the answer, and that there needs to be another way. And that is definitely what I'm hearing you guys saying. And I think the same could be said of Marxism, that it may be a helpful methodology for understanding how power is abused, which is absolutely a prophetic message throughout biblical texts in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. but how do you construct a positive vision to kind of satisfy this call that Hauerwas is making, where maybe you can adopt some of the institutions, maybe, or participate. That's probably better. Participate in the institutions of liberalism, like you can vote or you can invest in certain ways. But what is the assertion? Because I think, neither Marxism nor capitalism nor libertarianism or liberalism, I don't think they fully encompass or even consider or value, which is a word you guys address in the book, or rather buying in. They don't see love as an important or essential function. It's almost like incidental to human life. So beginning with love as a fundamental aspect of the gospel, how do you navigate an ideological and political and economic and world with the gospel as an epistemological foundation?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. That's a huge question. And thanks for raising epistemology. Most responses to Colossians Remixed were about praxis. That's where we got most pushback. What you mean to follow Colossians, to believe the gospel as articulated in Colossians, we need to be using recyclable organic cloth diapers. How dare you? That's when the book would get thrown across the room in people's studies.
And McDonald's, people didn't like it that we criticized McDonald's.
Yeah. But the epistemology stuff and how we talk about what it means to know hardly gets got a mention in the reviews. Anyway, that was a long way around to the question. I mean, love is at the heart of the gospel because love is at the heart of creation. Love goes all the way down. The earth is full of the steadfast love of God, says the psalmist in Psalm 33. So love is at the heart of absolutely everything. Now, Stanley Stanley can find a liberal sometimes where there aren't liberals, but that's okay, because liberalism really is as terrible a temptation as Stanley had always argued. And of course, what Stanley then is offering as an alternative is a communitarianism, very indebted to Alistair McIntyre. And that kind of communitarianism is absolutely right. How should an individual read Colossians Remixed? An individual shouldn't read Colossians Remixed. It should be read in community, always read in community, because we learn in community, we grow in community. Now, having said that, but how do we live within our own political, economic context? Stanley still will vote, and so will we. So then how do you vote? You end up voting along lines that you're basically asking, where are the policies that give us a better shot at shaping the kind of community of care that should be at the heart of any Christian economics? What kind of policies will help us develop a true oikonomos, a true normative household? Who is in the household? What kind of policies are going to create safety and welcome for most of our inhabitants, but especially those who are most vulnerable? They will all, liberation theology was right. There is a preferential option for the poor in the scriptures, a very clear preferential option for the poor. The scriptures is more concerned about justice than it is about prayer, for Pete's sakes. Justice is at the heart of Torah. So then we have to ask, who's going to offer us policies that are going to make healthcare available to all? And who's going to be giving tax cuts to billionaires while also cutting SNAP benefits, while also cutting U.S. aid? So you end up making these kinds of decisions, which doesn't mean that you totally buy the ideology of liberal democracy. You don't even need to totally buy the democratic socialism of a Bernie Sanders. But my hunch is if you're rooted in the gospel, you're going to be pretty more inclined towards Bernie Sanders than somebody as so self-consciously and explicitly Christian in quotation marks as Mike Johnson.
And to take it from that macro level down to a micro level.
Good, do that.
I mean, Paul was writing in a context, an imperial context that was very different from our own too, right? Even though ours is shifting, but you couldn't vote, you couldn't write letters to politicians in the ancient world. So the hope of influencing things at that level was minuscule. So what does Paul say to people? Well, you are forming communities. I'm using, I guess the language of Colossians works too. Communities of compassion and welcome and forgiveness and peace. In Romans, he describes it as communities that welcome the stranger and that practice generosity and that forgive their enemies. This is what these communities look like, as these alternative communities of mutual economic support and welcome for those who are most marginalized. So then the question can become, do we see that happening in our own culture? I've talked a little bit about what's happening now in some places in the United States, but there are also, I think, movements that emphasize how do we create a local community that works to let me think of the way to put this, how do we create local communities that are those communities of welcome and nurture and economic support today? And we see that in the transition town movement, where you have local economies. Part of the transition town movement is, having villages or towns or small cities come together and look at the community assets. How can food be grown locally? How can social programs be done locally? How can all of these things happen so that we're not dependent either on politicians further away, or on the networks of consumption from farther away, right? How can we make things more and more and more local so that when something comes down at a federal level, we can say, okay, that's happening at a federal level, but here in our local context, this is what we're doing that will ensure that doesn't destroy us, that doesn't impact us, that we have certain kinds of environmental things in place, land trusts in place to ensure that this land can't be destroyed, that we have certain kinds of networks between farmers and consumers that ensure food will be available, even if all the people who are harvesting and picking it in California are being deported, right? So there's just all these, there are movements around, for if people do some digging, that are creating these small communities. I mean, in some ways, you talk about a libertarian background. In some ways, there's a bit of the libertarian in this, in terms of we're not dependent upon these huge political structures. But on the other hand, it's deeply communal. It's like they say in permaculture circles, you can do all these great things on your farm for the land and for yourself so that you have food. But if you're not doing it for and with other people, you're just going to be a well-fed, lonely person. And so how do we create these local networks? And I should say, I've talked about people, but all other creatures are part of the local networks too. We're making a home for all creatures, because that's part of where the gospel story is going.
In terms of resources, never read Naomi Klein without reading Wendell Berry.
And I'll just acknowledge here, I've never read anything by Berry. I will say though, I hold the idea, the contradictory notion in my head though, that a book that made me say, like, I can't be a libertarian anymore, also I believe, maybe I'm remembering incorrectly, favorably cites both Robert Bork and I believe it's John Taylor Gatto or Gatto. I don't know how to pronounce his name, who's a homeschool advocate. And I would say that those were, prior to that, they were staples of my understanding of political engagement. And then, so there is very much like a local level within the anarcho-capitalist, libertarian, and anarcho-syndicalist, socialist worlds that they do want things lower level. And I don't expect that we're going to work all of that disagreement out today. As we're kind of transitioning, because we're over an hour, and I don't want to keep you guys all day, but is there anything from the book you were hoping I would ask about that I have not?
Oh, well, there's a lot in the book. So I don't think we're going to cover it all in an hour conversation. Let me say this. One of the things I didn't say earlier that applies to a big theme in the book, which is the theme of slavery. And we read the household codes as a liberative, subversive undermining of slavery in the ancient world. Paul at the end of Colossians says, remember my chains. And the images of people in chains in the ancient world were those who were the most violently subdued by empire, those who the empire had captured, those who almost always became slaves and who were paraded as slaves when they came back. Paul is telling people to remember that he is identified with those who are at the bottom of the empire, those who are most shamed, those who are most oppressed, and who have been captured by the empire. And I think in our own context, that it's almost a literal identification. If we're reading Colossians and we're not remembering that Paul is saying, look, for the sake of the gospel, I am in chains. I am identified with those who are being detained by ICE, with those who are being thrown into these detention centers with no access to anybody, who are being tortured, who are being denied food. We need to be reading Colossians from the perspective of those folks. We need to be saying, look, those are the folks that we need to be creating community for, that we need to be working for and identifying with. Because if we don't, we're not remembering the circumstances in which Paul himself wrote this letter. So I think today that's the moral imperative that this letter lays upon us.
Brian, anything? Anything that you were hoping I would ask about that I have not brought up?
Not really. No. There's lots of things we could talk about from the book, but it was 20 years ago. But it's still alive for us, and we still find ourselves. I mean, I preached on Colossians 2 summers ago to a little Baptist church here, with a voting membership of 7 people, and we got up to 28 people one Sunday morning. And I just, preached through Colossians with them, and it was as alive doing that with this little rural church 2 years ago as it was writing the book. We were writing it 25 years ago. It's continues to be, I think, a very, very profound engagement of the gospel, and engagement of the gospel within the context of empire.
Yeah, look, I look forward to I didn't want to read it before I had this conversation. I look forward to reading Romans Disarmed. So I'll be reaching out to you, the two of you, for that, and then to each of you for your forthcoming books that you both mentioned. So we've talked, like, billionaires have come up, and actually we should probably start talking about trillionaires at some point, because it sounds like that's a thing that's going to happen, as disgusting as it may be.
It's happened. Elon Musk.
Yeah. But a book that I feel like would have been included if you were writing this book now is Debt: The First 5,000 Years by the late David Graeber.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about a lot how super wealthy people leverage debt in a way that debt is a moralized issue for poor working and middle class people, but it is very much a tool that enhances wealth for people who are already wealthy.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that would fit quite well in the critique of empire if you were writing it now. But as far as if you were putting together a syllabus to supplement Colossians Remixed, and I'm sure that you have in one way or another over the years, what would each of you put on that? And that could be, books, articles, videos, podcasts, whatever.
Well, I mean, our friend Ched Myers, Healing Affluenza, and really even before that, Ched's late 80s book, Binding the Strong Man on the Gospel of Mark. I don't think that we would have been able to write Colossians Remixed without what Ched had done in Binding the Strong Man. I think that the overall kind of cultural analysis that we're doing really receives interesting philosophical and further cultural depth in Jamie Smith's Cultural Liturgics project, Awaiting the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, Desiring the Kingdom. Those three books certainly resonated really well.
I would add in terms of, we mentioned Wendell Berry, so really, Jared, you need to get on that.
You cannot talk to us again without reading Wendell Berry.
Yeah. I think also, just in terms right now of cultural analysis and what's going on, Rebecca Solnit's books, A Hope in the Dark and No Straight Line Takes You There, are just great short reads. And also she's just now has a Substack, or it's not on Substack, but it's on another platform called Meditations in an Emergency, that are really good at kind of digging deep into what's going on right now, along with Robert Reich. Neither of these are Christians, but are doing the kinds of cultural analysis that's deeply helpful, like Naomi Klein was doing and still does. In terms of other books relating to the New Testament, Bruce Longenecker published something around the time Colossians Remixed came out called The Lost Letters of Pergamum. That is a really, it's a series of letters between fictional characters in the ancient world. And he doesn't do so much with the imperial context, though he does a bit, but it really is a nice deep dive into what the Christian communities were like, and how they were being shaped, and the things they were wrestling with in the first century. So I would highly recommend that. Also, in terms of the Gospels, Warren Carter's books, Matthew and Empire, and his book on John. I don't know if it's called John and Empire or something like that, but Warren Carter is his name. I don't know, that title's just slipped my mind. He does great readings of the Gospels in terms of their background in the Hebrew Bible, but also the imperial context and what people were struggling with in the first century. So I would highly recommend those as well. There's just a lot being done on the imperial stuff that's very, very good now. Drew Strait has some stuff.
Also, I bring it back to epistemology, and what an epistemology of love looks like when you're engaging the world, and really, Indigenous writers help us into that more than anybody. So, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that is just one of the most beautiful books that you will ever read, and if you want to learn about botany from an Indigenous perspective, which is rooted in this deep relationality indeed a deep relationality of love within creation, then Indigenous writers really are way ahead of us on all this. Indigenous writers and the gospel and Christian faith, Randy Woodley's work, of course, is really crucial in all of this. And, we need to be learning more. If we want to learn about living responsible lives in the land, we need to learn from the people of the land. And if we want to do that in repentance of our own the benefits of empire, then we need to engage Indigenous culture and Indigenous writers with that repentance and with deep humility.
Yeah, and I would just add a couple other Indigenous authors. Leanne Betasamosaki Simpson's book, As We Have Always Done, particularly the chapter Land as Pedagogy, which has deep resonances with the biblical story. There's a book by Patty Crowetz, another Canadian, both Leanne and Patty are Canadian, called Becoming Kin, which is also just a very important book for thinking so Leanne Betasamosaki Simpson is not a Christian, but Patty Crowetz is Presbyterian. She is a Christian, so she's exploring some of these Indigenous themes from that perspective. And Danny Zacharias, another Canadian, has a book that's just coming out on Indigenous readings of the Bible that I've heard Danny speak, and I can only imagine that this book is wonderful based on hearing him speak.
I think you just set a record for recommendations, but they will all be linked in the show notes to this episode. Where should I begin with Wendell Berry?
Oh, unsettling.
Yeah. What is sex community?
Sex community culture, and the sex book. That's the essays in the sex book.
There's one called all our Wendell Berries downstairs on one shelf, but sex. Yeah, what's it called? Sex community. Google it, you'll find it.
I will.
That's the name of one of the essays in it. I mean, he's got fiction and poetry and essays. The essays, that book of essays is probably a good place to start. He's also there's a collection of his agrarian essays that are very good. It's Sex Economy, Something in Community. Yeah. That's the title.
Yeah, that's right.
But also read his poetry. And if you're going to begin with his novels, begin with Jayber Crow. That's one of his best. So Brian's looking up the Wendell Berry here for a minute while I blather on. But yeah.
While he's looking.
Sex Economy, Freedom, and Community. That's the name of the book.
Yeah.
That is where I will begin. Okay, my final question is, what do you read for fun?
I read. There are two women other than Sylvia who I take to bed. One is Barbara Kingsolver. Barbara Kingsolver often joins me in bed in one of her novels, and then a little lighter, but also I think wonderful writer, Canadian crime mystery writer Louise Penny. I like to take Louise Penny to bed, but right now I'm reading the Narnia Chronicles again just for the fun of it.
Sylvia?
I've kind of stopped reading fiction unless it's books I've already read lately. So I read, I read all kinds of stuff that's nonfiction, like on David Graeber is actually, I consider reading David Graeber reading for fun. Same with Rebecca Solnit. I've just finished her book, Orwell's Roses, which was brilliant. I could be reading articles about pollinators and field guides for birds as well for fun. So, and I guess if I really really don't want to think about what's troubling me in the world, then I read Agatha Christie's. Just kind of go back or Dorothy Sayers. Actually, Dorothy Sayers is even better in terms of just rereading something that's but right now I find that trying to keep up with what's going on in the news means that I don't want to read fiction about people going through those things. Reality seems to be enough. So maybe I'll come back to fiction someday. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you enjoy it, do it. If you don't, then do something else. That's great. Thank you both so much again for sitting down with me today. It means the world to me, and I love this book. I think about this book, and I have since I was 22, and I will continue to do it for at least another 20 years. So, yeah, have a great, wonderful rest of your day.
Okay. Thanks, Jared.
Yeah,
nice talking to you.
It's been a pleasure, Jared. Thanks.
Take care. Okay. Another episode done. I forgot to mention on the front end, but I was reminded between turning off that recording and starting a new recording for this outro, this is the 111st episode of the podcast, and that's exciting. For those of you who are not familiar, Lord of the Rings begins with Bilbo celebrating his 111th or 111st birthday. So, yeah, it's a big deal to be this far in. In honesty, as I sit here right now, I have up to 118 episodes recorded. I just don't have them pushed out yet. I remember when I first started the podcast and I was releasing episodes quarterly, and I think I may have had 1 or 2 episodes out, and I was talking to a coworker, and he said, you know, most podcasts, it's something like 90% of podcasts end before they hit 10 episodes, I think is what he said. And so at that moment, it's like, okay, well, if I get that far, I'm in the minority. And now here I am, well over 100. I think pretty confident in my process. And I still very much enjoy searching out content to put on here and reading and learning and having the conversations, and even the editing and sewing all the pieces of the episode together is still enjoyable for me. And so I'm very fortunate in that I have something that I think makes an impact. I think it allows me to not only learn, but to put something into the world that may possibly be helpful. So I appreciate all of you for listening, or if you're over, if you're picking this up on Patreon, for watching. If you are listening for free, though, this preview that you're about to listen to is available now on patreon.com/It Means What It Means podcast. So Jenny Grillo and I sat down to discuss her Journal of Biblical Literature article on having a body, time, and divine embodiment. And I was very much, I think, a kid in a candy store on this one. The concept of embodiment is, I think, one that I took for granted. So I may have asked some questions that took us in a direction that she may not have intended, but she was very helpful in getting me back on track. So next week you can hear for free my conversation with Jenny Grillo on that article. You can head on over to patreon.com/It Means What It Means podcast, chip in $5 a month, and you can hear or watch this episode in its entirety right now. That said, I do want to add one other thing. I've been thinking a lot about a point that Sylvia Keesmaat and Brian Walsh, Sylvia made and Brian emphasized, that inevitability is the discourse of empire. And I've been thinking about it more, especially in the last week or so. It just popped into my head from a conversation at work that inevitability is also the language of despair. And right now there's a lot worth despairing about. it seems that overwhelming violence is inevitable, that it is irresistible, that there is nothing that we can do about it. And I would say, if you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. The phrase "God has parts but not a whole." Can you go more into that? So you said like not a trunk, and then I'm trying to remember, are there passages where it's like God has a heart or something like that?
Yeah.
Is it not the animating and functioning, like internally functioning parts? How does that work?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. You're right that there are many places in which the Bible talks about internal organs for God, liver, the sort of organs that often in biblical language are used to speak about feeling. And that's something that I want to think more about. I don't like to take refuge in figurative language. I think there is a sense, though, in which those things often do the work of speaking about emotions in biblical texts and not always tissue. So you're right. You do get a sense of internal organs, although those may be ways to think about feelings and cognitive or emotional processes. But lots of hand and foot. Again, we can think about whether that's a way of thinking about agency to a certain extent. Certainly a lot of face. Interesting to me that face is absolutely speakable of God. As strangely as his back, those both kind of surfaces. It seems to, but blood, bone, and especially flesh, not thinkable of God. Those don't ever get predicated of God across biblical texts. Flesh itself seems to be, so biblical Hebrew doesn't really have a word for body like our word body in English. It doesn't. That's just not an easy equivalent. There are a few that are hardly ever used and more often refer to dead bodies. But there isn't really an obvious equivalent of body in biblical Hebrew. And the term that most often does duty for body is flesh, which can't ever be said of God. So that's what I mean by saying it seems much more thinkable to the biblical authors to speak of parts than of a whole or of a kind of big mass, if you like, for God.